Whitney Azoy.
Thank you all. There are many people I would like to thank individually, but there's a 30-minute clock there, new to me, and so I'll simply start. Thank you. When the invitation came to speak here today, my brief was phrased simply as the Afghans. It got me thinking, does that phrase represent a universally meaningful category? I promise not to use jargon again. Does it mean the same thing, in other words, to people everywhere, the term Afghans? The answer is no. For most of us, it means all the inhabitants of what's come to be called Afghanistan. But for Uzbek farmers on their rain-dependent slopes far above the rich Kunduz River bottomland, Afghanistan, or rather Afghan means Pashtun. In particular, the Pashtuns, whose grandfathers pushed their Uzbek counterparts off the floodplain and onto the dry hillsides. Today's Uzbek farmers in northern Afghanistan do not, among themselves, refer to themselves as Afghans, nor do the Hazaras of Yakalang in Bamiyan, out beyond where the Buddhists used to be, nor do they refer to themselves as Afghans. Their kinfolk were massacred a decade ago by the Pashtun Taliban. And the Hazaras of Yakalang call them Afghans. Then I began thinking about the term Afghanistan and how it started and what it's meant over time. And finally, I wondered about Afghanistan itself and whether it's here to stay. Hence my title, Is There Really an Afghanistan? Two more things at the outset. First, since 1972, I've often been wrong about Afghanistan. Second, I deeply hope that I'm wrong in my fear this morning. My fear is that 21st century Afghanistan, no matter who controls it, or more aptly claims to control it, lacks the DNA of sustainable nation statehood, and further, that since 1978 it has been in a slow-motion, agonizing process of collapse and disintegration. Let me develop this troublesome notion in terms of four factors: topography, ethnicity, political origins, and subsequent history. First, I acknowledge the legions of expat Afghanophiles who, following in the footsteps of Louis Dupree, believe that Afghanistan is a special case, that there's something in the water, that survival over the past 3 decades implies the 3 awful decades, implies unified survival indefinitely. As evidence, they cite the truly extraordinary anti-Soviet jihad. And they note, as Ahmad Rashid did yesterday, that even at the worst of times, no separatist movements arose. Afghans, we like to tell ourselves, fought as Afghans, won as Afghans, and stayed Afghans. I'm an Afghanophile, and I used to think this way, and I wish I still did. In fact, the jihad was won not because of patriotic unity, but despite the lack of it, despite the intense and bitter rivalries that occurred between ethnically based groupings of mujahideen. Rhetoric to the contrary, they were fighting and dying much less for their country than for their own lands and families and co-ethnics, and of course for Islam. As for the absence of separatist movements, no one ethnic region possessed the size and resources to exist on its own. And no matter how bad things got over the ensuing decades, who would want to be annexed by one of the dismal former Soviet stands, or by, forgive me, severely dysfunctional Pakistan, or by Iran, whose harsh treatment of Afghan refugees, even their fellow Shias from the Hazarajat, was well known. Perhaps there were no serious separatist movements because no serious options existed. Now back to the four main factors that prompt my fear. Next slide, please. Topography is a subset of geography, and as we all know, Afghanistan is landlocked. Not helpful, but not in itself a disqualifier for nation statehood. Consider Switzerland, to which some of the visionary or delusional planners of the new Afghanistan like to point. The problem is not geographical, it's more precisely topographical. The huge Hindu Kush mountain range running down from northeast to southwest and dividing the country smack dab down the middle. In fact, it is these mountains, not the Oxus River or the Indus River, that constitute the true geostrategic division between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. It's the Hindu Kush. Note that while rivers look nicely precise on maps and thus appeal to outsider setters of borders, the same people traditionally live on both sides of rivers, and all it takes to cross is a small boat. Mountains like the Hindu Kush are far more formidable impediments to people and to weather. Ask Alexander, ask the Soviets, ask the annual monsoon. Kabul and Kandahar face towards fertile India. Kunduz and Mazar towards the deserts of Central Asia. Not until 1964 did an all-weather road cross the Hindu Kush at 11,000 feet. Back then, and more so today, the Salang Pass is closed by snow several years every winter. 150 people died on that road in an avalanche last week. So there's a north and a south, and they're very, very different. Climatically, ethnically, culturally, one could almost say temperamentally. There's also a west, where the Hindu Kush dwindle into flat plains. The ancient city of Herat, located on these flatlands, faces westward and belongs to an area traditionally called Khorasan, a term which refers to sunrise. Sunrise from whose perspective? From the perspective of Persia, currently called Iran, for which Herat is naturally and formally its eastern frontier, perhaps its once and future eastern frontier. So topography argues that Afghanistan, far from being a unit unto itself, actually consists of three distinct frontier regions: the eastern fringe of Persia, the northwestern fringe of India, and the southern fringe of Central Asia. A recent National Geographic exhibit of so-called Afghan antiquities proposed that this threefold fringe quality gives all Afghans something in common and somehow unifies them. I find this argument well-intended and utterly nonsensical. Now to ethnicity, and the next slide, please. Now, many of you know the ethnic litany, but let me at least list and place the main groups. Certainly the most numerous are the Pashtuns, who inhabit a broad horizontal swath from below Herat in the west to below and beyond Kabul in the south and the east. When combined numerically with their brethren in northwestern Pakistan, they constitute the world's largest, or second largest after the Kurds, ethnic nation without its own state. Unless you're an Afghan Pashtun and you believe, as many of them do, that all Afghanistan belongs to you. There is some linguistic and historical ground for that belief. Afghan and Pashtun as words were originally synonymous and still are, as I've indicated, in the mouths of some non-Pashtuns. And modern Afghanistan dates its founding to the exploits of a Pashtun princeling in 1747. Most neutral demographers hold that Pashtuns represent a low 40-something plurality, 40-something% plurality in Afghanistan. Most Pashtuns of my acquaintance, from cabinet ministers to poppy growers, claim at least 60%. In their attitude towards the other groups, they resemble the Prussians of 19th century Germany or the Serbs of 20th century Yugoslavia. Pashtuns have ruled Afghanistan, as far as anybody's ever ruled it, for all but 2 brief periods in its 263-year history. The royal family was ancestrally Pashtun, albeit Persian-speaking. The Taliban are aggressively and assertively Pashtun. And so the wise men at Bonn, 2001, decided that whatever new leader would have to follow suit, but hoped for a somewhat detribalized Pashtun. Hence that young fellow with nice clothes and good manners that we'd all gotten to know in the drawing rooms of Peshawar and Islamabad. Hence Hamid Karzai. Trouble is, heartland Pashtun society remains well and truly tribal, and Pashtuns who act too detribalized run a risk. The eminent Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth notes that Pashtun Wali, the so-called Pashtun Code, includes a refusal to submit oneself to any form of supra-tribal authority, in particular to government. Government means taxes and census and conscription, all of them anathema to a traditional Pashtun. Once involved with government, Barth says, a Pashtun's cultural authenticity is called into question. Karzai was expected to deliver his Pashtun kinsmen. It hasn't happened, and Barth's observation may explain why not. If he's correct, the whole concept of a Pashtun state becomes an oxymoron. The other main ethnic groups, as you know, include Tajiks, Persian-speaking Indo-European, Hazaras, Persian-speaking Mongol descendant, Uzbeks and Turkomans, Turkic-speaking from East Central Asia, and a catch-all category of Eastern mountaineers, now called Nuristanis, whose language has changed spectacularly from valley to valley. These various non-Pashtun groups differ among themselves, but they share 2 things. First, a deep-seated, if often hidden, resentment of Pashtun hegemony. I well recall the shock of this recognition. At the embassy where I worked in the 1970s, the early 1970s, it's a closely guarded secret, not on your bios there, that I was once an American diplomat, closely guarded for good reason. At the embassy in the early 1970s, nobody ever spoke about ethnicity. It was, so the Afghan government officials told us, and so we believed, a quaint and outdated, innocuous issue. Then, in 1973, as some of you know, I committed career suicide by quitting the Foreign Service in favor of grad school anthropology. 3 years later, with my coursework completed, I was back in Afghanistan and living in a northern village and realizing to my astonishment that ethnicity, far from being past history, was the name of the game in all spheres of local life. And furthermore, that this game was rigged so that Pashtuns invariably won. The best land, the best water, the choice business locations in town, the fewest hassles from corrupt police. The governor, a Pashtun from Kandahar, a good friend, took me into his confidence and showed me a map with several villages in Kunduz along the river bottom with the same name, Nalkel. Nalkel has to do with transport and conveyance. The idea has to do with moving things. The Nalkel villages, all on rich bottom river bottom land, were people by Pashtuns who'd been moved north from their southern homeland by the Pashtun government in Kabul. Their mission, to convey Pashtunism to make Afghanistan Pashtun in name as well as in fact. In fact as well as in name, excuse me, in fact as well as in name. The other ethnicities had to sit and take it and hate it until the onset of chaos in 1978. Thereafter, each of them, in various combinations and subdivisions, reasserted a measure of long-lost autonomy. The Pashtun Taliban took it back from them in the late 1990s, but then came 9/11 and the miracle of our arrival and the non-Pashtuns' subsequent reassertion. They are not about to get bossed around again, except perhaps by their own ethnic bosses, who we tend to call warlords, in part because our perspective, fashioned in Peshawar and Kabul, remains more Pashtun-centric than we realize. The second point in common among non-Pashtun groups is that none of them is truly tribal any longer. Tribal is an oft misused term. It does not mean wild or savage or primitive or even uncontrollable. Rather, a tribal society, for anthropologists, a tribal society is one whose relationships, including political relationships, are structured by kinship. Much of Pashtun society in the South is authentically tribal in that sense. But in the North, there's been more mixing of people and more experience over time with government. And so, rather than a tribal society, the non-Pashtun areas display what could be called proto-civil society, suspicious of government, but not viscerally opposed to it. Note that our current troubles are not really with non-Pashtuns and not really in the North, except in those areas peopled by Naqel Pashtuns, sympathetic to their Taliban kinsmen. Now a bit of history. Afghan political historians maintain the current nation state began as a Pashtun enterprise in mid-18th century. Kandahar Pashtun forces under a vigorous young leader or warlord named Ahmad Shah Durrani created a short-lived empire that reached across the mountains up north, reached west beyond Herat, and east to Kabul, Peshawar, and even what is now northern India. And yet, as the great medieval sociologist Ibn Khaldun illustrates, Muslim societies tend to lose their, Muslim dynasties tend to lose their vigor and unity within 3 generations. After the princeling's death, his capital was moved to more cosmopolitan Kabul, and his conquests were squandered as descendants occupied themselves in vicious palace struggles. What was left of Afghanistan, a term first concocted in the early 19th century by the British, would likely have disintegrated completely had it not been for the advent of superpower politics and the Great Game. As their 19th century imperial borders crept ominously closer in Asia, Tsarist Russia and Victorian Britain tacitly recognized the value of a buffer between them. A weak Afghanistan, topographically fragmented and ethnically contentious, filled the bill. Its current borders, finalized in the 1890s, thus reflect the interests of Moscow and especially London more than those of Kabul. Especially London, because Abdurrahman Khan, the Iron Amir, who ruled from 1880 to 1901, decided to make a deal with the more distant of the 2 empires, British subsidies in return for British control over foreign affairs. The subsidies allowed Abdurrahman to finance and achieve unprecedented internal control, and Afghanistan was far safer in 1900 than it is in 2010. But this accomplishment came at two costs, and these have haunted Afghanistan ever since. One is the matter of arbitrary borders, such as the well-known 1893 Durand Line, drawn by London to separate Afghanistan from British India, now Pakistan, and to divide the Pashtun people in half. The Afghans hated it, but for the sake of subsidies, had to swallow it. Its consequences now dominate our news. A second cost of Abdur Rahman's deal with the British has to do with the precedent of subsidies. But for British money, but for those subsidies, the Iron Amir would have been made of tinfoil. Subsequent rulers have extended this pattern of dependence. Buffer state financial handouts and dependence have continued with variations until 1978. Bolsheviks overthrew czars in 1917, and America later replaced Britain as the Western champion east of Suez. No matter. Still weak in itself, Afghanistan remained interposed precariously but also profitably between the two giants of the age. Neither the USSR nor the US wanted hot war, and together their tacit agreements maintained Afghanistan's territorial integrity. Soviet rubles and US dollars paid for a modicum of internal security and economic development. Chronically unable to foot its own bills, Afghanistan as a buffer state languished, but also survived. That era ended with the Marxist coup of April 1978. Suddenly, Afghanistan went from being a laid-back buffer to a Cold War Soviet proxy. Now, only one side, the Soviet Union, provided the money and offered the guarantees. When those guarantees proved first insufficient and then when they all together disappeared, Afghanistan descended into the maelstrom of conflict from which it is yet to recover. Does it have the political DNA to do so? Well, let's recall that nation states have only recently, since the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, become humanity's political unit of choice. Before then, at least in Eurasia, we had vaguely demarcated empires and spheres of control. These waxed and waned, came and went. The only enduring socio-political unit was not the artificial city, the artificial state, but the organic city. The city. Cities endure. Cities such as Herat. And the truly well-based leader, the leader with the truest sort of support, was someone like Herat's current homeboy, whom we like to call warlord Ismail Khan. Well, nowadays, some modern nation states, fortunate in their DNA, have a natural purpose. Their sole reason for existence is as a viable instrument for their own people. Take Iceland, admittedly an extreme example in its topographical unity and ethnic homogeneity. Iceland exists, pure and simple, for the sake of Icelanders. No contrived purpose is required. Afghanistan, as currently configured, presents the other extreme. A nation state with fragmented topography, mutual hostile ethnicities, arbitrary borders established by outsiders, and a continued existence maintained until 1978 by outsiders as a buffer state. What happens to such a feeble outfit when the outsider need for it disappears? Yes, the international community has a stake in existing structures. And yes, stability, as I recall from my brief service, is important to the State Department. But structure and stability do not come cheap in Afghanistan. Who, in the long term, will hold it together? Who, long term, will pay its bills? Well, now, Afghanistan's nation-state apparatus is again, at least temporarily, supported by outsiders because of the confrontation between militant Islam and the West. What will happen once this conflict subsides or once its epicenter shifts elsewhere? Does the current bloodshed and hyper-corruption represent merely growing pains of an Afghanistan on the way to eventual success? Or are we witnessing the gradual deterioration and ultimate disappearance of a nation-state that, except for the impulse of Pashtun expansionism, never really had a rationale of its own? Could it have been different if different decisions had been made in 2001, 2, and 3? Perhaps so, at least in the short run. Certainly our false premised invasion of Iraq diverted key resources at a time when al-Qaeda and the Taliban were on the run. Those resources could perhaps have closed the military deal in the short run. In my opinion, a pair of even more consequential mistakes had already been made at the Bonn Conference in December 2001. First, it was decided proudly and unrealistically to make Afghanistan far more government centralized, far more than ever before, certainly far more than before the Troubles. Secondly, and stupidly, the pre-conflict monarchy was discarded, shunted aside. And let's take those decisions and make a comparison between Afghanistan, where I worked for so many years, and Spain, where I now live. Afghanistan, at the time of Bonn, had suffered the worst last quarter of the 20th century of any country on earth. Coup, counter-coup, holy war, civil war, material destruction, massive human death and displacement. Now contrast Afghanistan to Spain, which, after Franco's death in 1975, had arguably the world's best end of quarter century. The best end of quarter century. How come? Enormous progress was made on all fronts, thanks to the balance provided by a new Spanish constitution that blended two seemingly opposed initiatives. First, it returned the monarchy as a symbol of national identity. Second, it allowed for unprecedented regional autonomy. Note that exactly the opposite was done to Afghanistan at Bonn. Now it may be too late. The old king, who had far deeper Pashtun support than Karzai, is dead. And Karzai, re-elected in a farce and faced with unprecedented levels of corruption, maintains the same doomed centralist facade while negotiating with the Taliban movement that, I believe, has little reason to negotiate. All of what Ahmad Rashid said last night is true. But hey, in the end, we're leaving and they're staying. And they know it. And we have the watches, but they have the time. Why negotiate? Given this shambles, worsening daily, what should U.S. policy be? Should we continue our much ballyhooed efforts to nation build in the name of centralized government? This strategy, rooted in familiar 21st century assumptions, could be called recreate the state. Speaking of the current U.S.-led offensive in Helmand province, our General McChrystal says, "We've got a government in a box," by which he means representatives of the Kabul government. We've got a government in a box ready to roll in. Well, maybe so, but what happens when our troops roll out? Almost certainly the central government officials will roll out shortly afterwards, and the Taliban will roll back in. So much, at least in the Pashtun South, for recreate the state. Which leaves us with what I call bribe the tribe. This other strategy, old-fashioned to the point of archaic, is more or less how the British coped in their day. And it's what we seem now to have announced and maybe even started, despite Karzai's fury, with the Shinwaris, a key tribe of frontier Ghilzai Pashtuns. Here's the deal. Our development resources delivered directly to tribal elders with no Kabul officialdom involved, in return for Shinwari agreement to burn the houses of Taliban collaborators. That's what Pashtuns do when they want to make life difficult. They burn their houses. Will the Shinwari stick to this bargain? Even if they do, it won't be a one-time fix. We'll have to do it year after year, and maybe Pashtun tribe by Pashtun tribe, as long as militant Islamist terrorism makes its home in the Pashtun heartland. It could take decades, would take decades. But compared to what we do now, it would cost fewer American lives, and probably fewer Afghan lives, and maybe even fewer U.S. tax dollars. Bribe the tribe, of course, would not be regarded as directly supportive of the Afghan central government and thus the Afghan nation state. Indeed, it would seem to undermine these modern era institutions. So I don't necessarily advocate a return to 19th century style politics. But at a minimum, here's what I do recommend. Let's bite the bullet and ask ourselves whether, long term, Afghanistan is going to survive anyway. Whether it has the DNA of enduring nation statehood. I have my doubts. I hope I'm wrong, and I thank you for listening.